tell us what happened yesterday at the hearing?
So the hearing. So the hearing process is controlled by the board. The board appoints the hearing officer, and then the hearing officer makes a recommendation to Forrest Claypool. And Forrest Claypool makes a decision whether to suspend it. So we all know where that's going. Then there's an ISB hearing, where the hearing officer is a bit more independent, but they make a recommendation to the unelected board appointed by our mayor. So we all know where that's going. And then after that, my legal options are open and everything's, on the table.
So you expect to be suspended, is what you're saying?
I expect this administration to do what it intends to do.
And you're prepared, if there's a suspension, to fight that in court?
All legal options are on the table. Marianne?
Yes, I think she was referring to it. Tell us more about, were you trying to expose some kind of wrongdoing, new contracts that CPS is about to take on? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So that wasn't my intention at first. I was trying to set up meetings with principals for this election. And in the process, I received an email from someone else who wanted principals to know the details of those contracts. And I set up a meeting with that other person, a meeting I eventually had to postpone. And everything else I have already described in great detail in terms of CPS seemed to have gotten my meeting, because I set the meetings up in the same day. And so I had a meeting set up with principals to campaign for office and to help them understand the platform for helping CPAA to become a member-driven organization that gets principals involved in helping to shape and influence, or at least influence, policy. That was the goal. But somehow CPS thought that meeting was for the purpose of connecting those principals with that insider, which it wasn't. And the reason I know that is because the person who was in charge of blocking access to our meeting let it slip. She said, this is an illegal Aramark Sodexo meeting. And I thought, where did she get that from? And I can't think of any other place. I didn't tell anyone about that meeting. No one, not a soul. And so, my guess was that the district was monitoring my email communications and assumed that my principal's meeting was a meeting with that insider, Ms. Fitzpatrick from the Sun-Times. Did you have a question?
I have a couple. Did you have that meeting with the Sodexo insider?
I'm going to keep that one to myself.
Have you learned anything new about how that contract is going?
I'm going to keep that one to myself.
Are you still legally able to be the head of CPAA?
Yes. The CPA Constitution states in Article 6 that you must be a member in good standing at the time of the convening of the nominating committee. So the nominating committee convened. They nominated me, and then they closed business. And so I was a member in good standing at the time of the convening of the nominating committee.
Are you concerned that in the wake of the CPS action against you, that principals will be less likely to elect you?
No.
You think they would still take that action?
I think it can go either way, but it's not for me to be concerned. It's for me to do everything I can to help them understand the potential of this organization. And it's been made very difficult because CPS has banned me from having access to principals now. But to do everything I can to help them to understand the potential of this organization and the potential of their power, the power of their involvement. The united voices of members. I think principals are in a weakened state because we're isolated. And I think that bringing us out of that state of isolation to come together, to deal with issues that we have a common passion about, can do quite a bit to empower principals. I wrote a post on my blog. It was called Thieves in the Night. That was a perfect example of this. CPS released an email on a Friday night telling us that our budgets for special education were going to be cut the following Tuesday. Right? The following Wednesday. And some principals got it over the weekend. Most of them didn't because they were gone. They said that we had until Tuesday to appeal. And on Monday, they scheduled all of our counselors who would write the appeal for a district-wide professional development session, so they weren't in our schools to appeal. And so it seemed like a setup to chop resources from to take resources from our special ed students. Several principals came together They weren't even in the association. They came together, they analyzed the situation, and they put together 8 demands. And they didn't even call them demands, they called them requests. And they brought them to CPS that Sunday night. And one of the demands was to let them know the formula by which they made these cuts, because it wasn't a very transparent process. Another demand was to extend the deadline, and they had several others. And they spoke to CPS with respect. They didn't call them demands, they just called them requests. But then they came with power and said, if you don't meet these requests, we'll be going to the press. The very next day, Janice Jackson and Forrest Claypool came out with an email to principals with a list of 8 things they were going to change. And all 8 of those were on the original list from those principals. But they didn't, Forrest and Janice didn't frame it as if we're meeting your demands. They framed it as if those were ideas that they just had. They sort of rethought it. But those principals, they had 50 signatures, right? And so it was the power of their collective voice. They didn't even have an official status to negotiate with CPS, but they had unity, right? And because of that unity, CPS listened to them, and those budget cuts were rescinded, right? And so I think principals have to come out of that isolation and begin to speak. There's no group of people in CPS or in this system that have the vantage point that principals have. We're at the nexus between where policy is formed in legislatures and board meetings and where they're implemented in schools and classrooms. We see it all. And we have to have a voice in influencing policy. Right? If you want good policy, why would you not bring that voice in? Right? So that's what I have to help principals to understand. Right? I can't worry about all of the other stuff. That's my job.
And the election is when?
The election's happening right now. It's a mail-in election. It began May 2nd. It will end on March 16th. The ballots, excuse me, May 16th. The ballots are due, supposed to be mailed by May 16th. They're due into the office by May 18th. They'll be counted on May 19th.
At the same time, while you're making this effort to leave the organization, there are principals in the city who say that you don't speak for them. What's your response to that?
So that's the point, right? We want to create an organization where principals can speak for themselves, where they feel comfortable coming out and speaking about policy no matter what their opinion is. And so part of what I say to principals is I've done a decent job at getting my voice heard. I'm running for president of CPA to make sure you get your voice heard. Whether it's a voice that agrees with mine or not, principals' voices have to be out there. That's part of the democratic process, right? Because if the voices aren't out there, we can't improve our thinking. If we don't have a venue in which you tell me your ideas and I hear yours and you hear mine and we hear each other's ideas, how does that improve our thinking about our work, the work that we do for our children? And so, that's the point, Juan. That's the point.
What do you say to principals who are more scared than ever based on what happened to you? What do you say to them?
What I say to principals that are more scared than ever.
That they're gonna watch their emails. They're gonna.
So, I would say that the only thing that will lead to what you fear is your fear. Because CPS and the mayor's office and the people who fund the mayor, the people who are behind him, have an agenda, and they're going to continue to carry out that agenda step by step by step and dismantle the public school system. It's just a matter of time. And if in your fear you step back and you retreat, that's going to happen. The only thing that's going to stop that from happening is you putting your fear aside and acting on what you know to be right. You have a military veteran who risked his life to fight for the freedoms in our Constitution. And you're attempting to deny him those freedoms. One of the things I said to a principal once, who was scared, it's another response to your question. I said, if you are afraid to speak because of what you think your government, because that's what CPS is, a governmental unit, if you think your government is going to punish you for it, then go up to your 8th grade classroom where they're studying the Constitution and tell them that it's all a lie. that the freedom of speech is not real because it's not real in you. That it's just an illusory goal or fantasy. Tell them that it's not real. If you don't want to tell them that, then speak without fear. We can't say this stuff that we say to our children and to each other about us being the freest country in the world, and at the same time be scared to speak. We can't live. That's not life. That's not living. We can't live that lie. We have to make the Constitution live by living the Constitution. And that's what I do. That's the choice that I decided to make for myself.
Speaking of your 8th graders, Betsy mentioned this. It's hard for a lot of parents say they don't know how to explain this to their kids. How would you explain it to a CPS kid who's confused by what's going on here?
Wow. So, I'm a teacher. And so I like to plan my lessons. I don't come up with lessons off the top of my head. So I couldn't tell you right now, but I would ground it in American history. I would ground it in the Constitution. I would take this situation and divide it up into its elemental parts, and the parts that connect with themes throughout the history of this country. This isn't the first time this happened to anybody in America, right? This is a continuous theme that operates. I like thematic teaching, and so I would use this as one example in a thematic unit on freedom of speech versus the need for government to, do its job, right? That's sort of the juxtaposition that this kind of thing is taught in and talked about in. And so I would couch it in those terms and talk about the different elements and have the kid think about it for himself.
If elected, has there been any determination of whether you'd be able to return to Blaine as principal while also being president of the CPAA?
Well, that's not my goal.
With an executive director.
So the executive director conversation is off the table. So I'm thinking I probably don't even need to answer your question if I tell you that, right? It's off the table. Okay.
Was that something you took off the table, or was that CPAA?
Again, I believe in democracy. So when I took it to the board of CPAA, they didn't like it. Now, as president, I could have done it. I had the power to just do it. But the board said no, and I respected that. That's something people don't get. People ask me, well, would you tolerate what you do from your teachers? I encourage what I do from my teachers. If you go back and look at my statement in response to the warning resolution, there's a link at the end, and you'll see a link to an email I sent my teachers about Park. And in that email, I tell them my position. And I say, you are free to disagree, and you are free to voice your disagreement. And in case they didn't believe that, I say it again at the end. Right? We don't make good decisions when we repress the voices of people who disagree with us. We don't. If we want what's good for our kids, we create an environment where everybody gets their say. A free and open debate. That's what democracy is supposed to be.
So what about your opponent then? He hasn't had the ability to use this situation to extend his platform for candidacy for this office. What about that?
What do you mean?
He doesn't have this opportunity to have all these cameras here to talk about his candidacy for the office that he's seeking. But you do. We're talking about debate.
Hold on.
We're talking about debate here. So the question is whether you have an advantage that he doesn't.
So again,
Talk about candidacy.
I don't get into speculation, but I'll say this. You have to wait. That weighs up against this other idea that he gets to go from school to school every day. People call me every day. He was at my school today when I don't, right? That there's this fear factor that they've created that's against me that he doesn't have. And so who knows what impact those things are going to have. I have no idea why. It's certainly an element, and I don't think you're wrong for bringing it up. No, it is an element. It exists. I don't know what else to say about it. Good question. That's another thing about this administration, right? So the way it was done is another example of their corrupt way of doing things and incompetent way of doing things and this political nature. So they came in and changed all the locks on the building. So not only did I not get to meet him, I didn't even get to go back in the building. So they came in and changed all the locks. You could have just got my keys, right? You just spent $2,000 changing locks. Why did you do that? It's a psychological tool. I don't know if people know this. I remember hearing about, there's a thing when prosecutors really want to taint a jury against a defendant. I read a story about how sometimes they'll shackle them up from head to toe and bring them in with all this security to give the jury the sense that this person must have done something wrong, right? And so you remove me from my school, and then you go around and change all the locks and give different keys to people to give the sense that this is someone who's unsafe, that he must have done something, right? And so not only did I not meet him, there's no way I would have met him. That's completely in opposition to the way they do things at CPS. They wasted money for that political sort of PR tool to prejudice my own staff against me.
Speaking of money, I know you're not currently in the thick of things, but principals have heard the budgets, so student-based budgeting is going to get cut again. There was a memo that went out, and
that has consequences. Right? When you cut a budget, you cut a person. And that person is not a layoff, right? That person represented a service that was being delivered to children. And when that person's gone, that service is no longer there for those children. And so again, we have to make a decision about what we're going to do, right? Why are those services being cut? Well, there's a narrative being touted out there about austerity and not having enough money. And we have to do the work that's needed to counter that narrative. Raise Your Hand is doing great work on that in terms of their emphasis on generating revenue. There are revenue sources everywhere that this administration has failed to tap. After they cut our budget mid-year, the city council was going to vote on a resolution to send about $100 million in the CPS so we wouldn't take those mid-year cuts. And this administration sent its allies into city council to squash that resolution. It was just a resolution to squash it, right? The money was there, but they did not want that money headed to CPS. They have other plans for that money. And so that's being supported with a narrative and hidden with a narrative. We have to come out and speak another narrative and get that narrative into the public dialogue so that when they speak it, when they say it, when they push it, they get pushed back. And we have to get to a point where they get so much pushback, they don't even feel comfortable saying it anymore, and that they have to act. So, I think I will take one more question, and we'll leave. Anybody else?
Can you hit the button? Can you hit that
Can
button?
I hit the button? Perfect question. I'm going to go find my phone and hit the button, the publish button. Thank you all so much for coming out. I appreciate it.